The entire auction hall burst into laughter when Lot 47 rolled onto the stage a rust-covered Aston Martin that looked more like compressed scrap metal than a luxury automobile. The auctioneer leaned into his microphone, smirked, and called it dead on arrival, then hammered it down for just $200 to a man in the back row wearing a jacket with a torn elbow patch. Nobody in that room believed the man was smart. Nobody believed he had a plan. They figured he was desperate, or broken, or maybe just the kind of stubborn fool who throws his last dollar at a dying horse. But 14 days later, that same rust-covered car was surrounded by international reporters, veteran collectors, and billionaires who had flown in from 4 different continents. By the time the sun touched the edge of the horizon that evening, the car that had drawn nothing but laughter sold for $10 million, and one secret hidden inside it changed a single father's life in ways no one in that auction hall could have imagined. His name was Daniel Carter. 38 years old, calloused hands, quiet voice. The kind of man who said less than he felt and worked harder than anyone noticed. He lived on the east side of town in a rented house that had seen better decades, a sagging front porch, a water stain shaped like a continent spreading across the kitchen ceiling, a furnace that groaned through winter nights like it was arguing with itself. He had a daughter named Lily, 10 years old, with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she was the only reason Daniel Carter got out of bed every morning without hesitation. Her mother, Rachel, had died 3 years earlier from an illness that moved faster than any of the doctors predicted. She was gone in 7 months, and when she left, she took with her the warmth that had filled that small house, and left behind a silence that Daniel had never quite learned how to furnish. He didn't talk about Rachel much. He kept one photograph on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, Rachel laughing at something outside the frame, mid-laugh, completely unaware of how beautiful she looked in that exact moment. Daniel had been a mechanic for 15 years, good with his hands, patient with engines, the kind of technician who could diagnose a problem by sound alone, who could stand at the front of a car with the hood up, listen for 30 seconds, and name what was wrong before he touched a single component. He had learned the trade from his father, who had learned it from his own father before that. And there was a pride in that lineage that didn't require announcement. He simply knew what he was doing, and he did it well, and for 15 years that had been enough. But the shop he'd worked for had shut down 8 months ago, when the owner retired and sold the building to a developer who tore it down within 6 weeks and began constructing a parking structure. The sign that had hung over the garage entrance for 24 years was gone in an afternoon. Since then, Daniel had picked up contract work wherever he could, a brake job here, an oil change there, a weekend, helping a neighbor replace a head gasket, but nothing steady, nothing that paid the rent reliably or let him plan more than a week ahead. The landlord, a man named Gerald Hooper, had left 2 notices on the door in the past 6 weeks. The second one had a number underlined in red ink and a handwritten note at the bottom that said simply, "By the end of the month." Daniel owed 4 months in back rent. And Gerald Hooper was not a patient man, and Daniel had no argument to make that would change any of that. Lily's school had sent home a permission slip for a 3-day science trip to a research center 2 states over. The cost was $340. Daniel had folded the slip into his jacket pocket and kept it there for 11 days without signing it, because every time he reached for a pen, something else came up that cost money he didn't have. A new inhaler for Lily's mild asthma, a repair to the furnace that the landlord refused to cover, a copay for a doctor's visit that turned out to be nothing serious but still cost $40 he hadn't planned on spending. The refrigerator in that house held half a carton of eggs, a block of cheese that had started to harden at the edges, and 3 cans of soup that Lily had arranged by color on the second shelf, gold, red, orange, as if organizing them made the shortage feel less real. Daniel had sold his truck tool set to cover October's utilities. He had sold his father's old pocket watch to buy groceries the week before. And then, on a Tuesday night when Lily had gone to bed claiming she wasn't hungry, he had watched her push half her dinner toward his side of the table with a story about having eaten a big lunch at school, a story he knew was completely invented. Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table and looked at his hands for a long time. These hands had rebuilt engines from near nothing. These hands had once taken apart a transmission that 3 other mechanics had walked away from and put it back together in a weekend. He had built things, fixed things. He believed, in the marrow of him, that broken things could be restored. His own father, a man who repaired furniture in a small shop for 40 years, had told him once, in that plain and unforgettable way he had of saying things, the stuff the world throws away is sometimes the most valuable thing in the room. You just have to have the eyes to see it. Daniel had never forgotten that. He repeated it to himself, the way some people repeat prayers. It was that same Tuesday night when a neighbor mentioned almost as an aside, leaning over the fence between their yards, that the National Savings Bank was holding a salvage auction the following Saturday morning. Seized vehicles, repossessed inventory, everything priced to move. Daniel went inside, wrote the address on the back of an envelope, and tucked it under the photograph of Rachel on the windowsill. He didn't sleep much that night, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than dread when he thought about the morning. The auction lot was held in a cleared industrial yard on the south end of the city, and by the time Daniel arrived at 7:30, the serious buyers were already moving through the rows of vehicles, like predators circling a watering hole. These were dealers and flippers, men and women with clipboards and smartphones, calling out to each other in the shorthand of people who do this every weekend. They wore branded jackets. They drove pickup trucks with company names stenciled on the doors. They walked past the beat-up sedans and minivans without breaking stride, heading straight for the vehicles worth arguing about. Daniel had $212 in his wallet. Everything he had liquid. He walked slowly. He looked carefully. He was not there to bid on something probable. He was there to find something that everyone else had already dismissed. Most of the inventory was predictable. Salvage title SUVs with airbag deployment. Fleet vehicles with 6-figure mileage. A row of motorcycles that had clearly lost arguments with pavement. Daniel moved through all of it, methodical and quiet, until he reached the far corner of the yard. The section that nobody else had bothered to walk to, separated from the main lot by a chain-link divider and a hand-lettered sign that said, "Additional lots as is." Behind that divider, half covered by a tarpaulin that the wind had pulled loose from one corner, sat a car unlike anything else in the yard. It was an Aston Martin. Or rather, it had been. The paint had oxidized into something between maroon and rust that made it look like a wound that had never quite healed. The front left quarter panel was crushed. The windshield had a crack running corner to corner. All 4 tires were flat. The rubber dried and cracked. The rims sunk into the gravel, as though the car had slowly lowered itself in exhaustion. Whoever had last touched this car had left it years ago, maybe decades, and it had sat in that condition, accumulating dust and indifference, until the bank had taken possession of it, along with everything else from a defaulted estate. Daniel stood in front of it and did not laugh. Everyone else who drifted over laughed. A dealer in a red jacket glanced at it and said, without breaking stride, "That thing belongs in a graveyard." Another man took one photograph, laughed at his own photograph, and walked away. The auctioneer, a round-faced man named Mitch, who had been running salvage auctions for 22 years, had already told the crowd it was dead on arrival and expected it to go unsold or donated. But Daniel wasn't looking at the rust. He was looking at the shape underneath. He crouched at the front grille and studied the badge. Not a standard production badge, but something slightly different, the proportions subtly off in a way that suggested it had been made separately and attached by hand. He moved around to the driver's side and looked through the cracked window at the interior. The leather had cracked and faded, but it had been hand-stitched in a pattern he had never seen on a production vehicle. The stitching was too intricate, too deliberate. He tried the door unlocked and leaned inside. The dashboard was bespoke. Custom gauges with hand-engraved faces, a steering wheel that did not match any catalog he had ever seen, and there, beneath the steering column, almost invisible unless you were already crouching exactly where Daniel was crouching, a small stamped symbol, a circle with a feather inside it. Not a manufacturer's mark. Something else entirely. Daniel straightened up. He thought about his father's words. He thought about Lily pushing her dinner across the table. He thought about the permission slip still folded in his jacket pocket. Then he walked to the registration table, filled out a bid sheet, and wrote the number $200 in the box marked Maximum Offer. Getting the car home nearly ended the whole story before it began. The tow company Daniel had called was 40 minutes late. By the time they arrived, the afternoon sky had darkened, and the temperature had dropped sharply. The Aston Martin, predictably, refused to roll freely. A seized brake caliper on the rear axle locked one wheel at an angle, which meant the tow truck driver had to use a flatbed rather than a dolly, which cost Daniel an extra $40 he negotiated down to $25, after explaining his situation with a candor that the driver, a weathered man named Pete, seemed to respect. By the time they arrived on Daniel Street, it was past 6 in the evening. 3 neighbors had come out onto their front stoops. One of them, Mrs. Delgado from across the street, watched with her arms folded and her head tilted, and the expression of someone watching a very familiar kind of mistake happen in slow motion. The man next door, a retired accountant named Frank, who had strong opinions about property values, came all the way down to the curb and stared at the rust-covered car being lowered onto the cracked asphalt of Daniel's driveway, and then stared at Daniel and said, with genuine bewilderment, "You paid money for that?" Gerald Hooper, the landlord, happened to drive by during this exact moment, slowed his car to a stop, rolled down his window, and looked at the Aston Martin on the flatbed, then at Daniel, and said nothing at all. He just drove away slowly. The silence was worse than anything he might have said. Inside the house, Lily was at the kitchen table doing homework. When Daniel came in, she looked up, and he told her he had bought something at the auction. She asked what. He told her it was a car. She asked if it worked. He told her not yet. She thought about this for a moment, and then said, with the absolute and uncomplicated certainty that only a 10-year-old can produce, "Mom always said you could fix anything." Daniel looked at his daughter for a moment. He didn't trust himself to speak. He nodded, put on his work jacket, went out to the garage, turned on the single hanging bulb, and began. He worked through that night and most of the next day. He cleared debris from the engine bay, drained lines that had gummed solid, pulled the battery, and replaced it with a spare he had from a previous job. The engine was seized. He had expected that, but it was seized in a way that suggested it had simply been sitting, not that it had been destroyed. Penetrating oil, patience, careful, deliberate work. He pulled the head and found no scoring on the cylinders, remarkable given the apparent age and condition of the car. But what he found as he worked deeper into the vehicle was more remarkable than the engine. On the firewall, stamped into the metal rather than printed on a plate stamped, which meant it was done at fabrication. Not after was a chassis number. He photographed it with his phone. He cross-referenced it against 3 different Aston Martin registry databases he found online. The number did not appear in any of them. It was not unregistered. It was as though it had never existed. And then, while cleaning the interior, he ran his hand along the base of the driver's seat and felt something that was not upholstery and was not frame. A seam, deliberate, disguised under a layer of leather that had been glued and aged to match the surrounding material. He pressed. He felt a resistance that was mechanical, not structural. A hidden compartment. He tried his fingers along every edge of it. It would not open. He sat back on his heels in the dusty garage, staring at the seat, and the single hanging bulb swayed slightly in a draft from somewhere. Then he stood, went back to the driver's door, and ran his thumb along the inside of the door handle because every hidden compartment he had ever encountered in custom coachwork had a corresponding key, and the key was almost always close. His thumbnail caught something. He turned the handle upside down, a small compartment in the underside of the handle casing, no larger than a matchbox. Inside it, on a piece of aged cloth, no bigger than a playing card, sat a key the size of a fingernail. The compartment under the seat was lined in dark velvet that had held its color better than anything else in the car. Daniel opened it with hands that were steadier than he expected. Inside, arranged with a care that suggested someone had placed these objects knowing they might not return for them, were three things. The first was a pocket watch, not a simple timepiece, but a complications movement in a rose gold case, the kind that required a watchmaker with decades of experience and access to tools that most workshops didn't carry. The second was a folded sheaf of papers, handwritten documents in English, faded but legible, describing the car's specifications in technical language that Daniel couldn't fully parse but understood enough of to feel the weight of. And the third was a photograph, black and white, printed on paper that had yellowed at the edges but preserved the image with startling clarity. A man in his 50s, well-dressed, standing beside the Aston Martin, which in the photograph was gleaming, perfect, clearly brand new. On the back of the photograph, written in the same hand as the documents, were three lines: the year 1964, the words, "completed as requested," and a name. Sir Edward Whitmore. Daniel set the photograph on his workbench and looked at it under the light for a long time. Then he went inside, made coffee, opened his laptop, and began searching. It took him 40 minutes to find the first references. And then the results cascaded. Sir Edward Whitmore, British national, born 1911, died officially in 1971, under circumstances that multiple sources described as unclear, an extraordinarily private collector of automobiles, art, and rare instruments. Believed to have owned or commissioned vehicles that had never been publicly registered or displayed. His estate had been disputed for years after his death, and large portions of his collection had simply never been accounted for. One automotive history website, run by an amateur British historian, had a page dedicated entirely to Whitmore, with a list of vehicles believed to have been commissioned. Near the bottom of the list, marked with an asterisk and the word "unverified," was a description that made Daniel's coffee go cold beside him. A bespoke prototype. 1964, rumored to have been built for purposes unrelated to private leisure. Chassis number unknown, whereabouts unknown. Disappeared before public registration. The historian had written a single editorial note at the bottom of the entry. If this vehicle still exists, it is arguably the most historically significant, unregistered British automobile of the 20th century. Daniel sat with that sentence for a while. He was not an impulsive man. He did not reach for the phone immediately. He sat with it, turned it over, applied skepticism to it the way he applied it to every engine diagnosis. He considered the possibility that none of this was what it appeared to be. He considered the possibility that it was exactly what it appeared to be. Then he photographed the documents, the watch, and the photograph, posted them with a brief description to a closed online forum for classic British automotive enthusiasts, using a username he'd had for years but rarely used. He went to bed at 2 in the morning. By 5:45, when Lily knocked on his door to say she was awake, he had 37 replies, 4 private messages, and 1 phone call from a number he didn't recognize that had gone to voicemail at 4 in the morning. He played the voicemail while still lying in bed. A man's voice, British, controlled, and barely containing something underneath the control. "My name is Marcus Webb. I'm a specialist in post-war European automobiles with particular focus on bespoke coachwork. I saw your post approximately 9 minutes ago, and I have been staring at your photographs for the remaining time. I need to ask you something, and I need you to take a moment before you answer. Do you even realize what you own?" Daniel called Marcus Webb back at 7 that morning, standing on his back porch with a mug of coffee and a frost-covered yard. The conversation lasted over 2 hours. By the time it ended, Webb had said he was booking a flight, no, not a commercial flight, a private arrangement, and asked Daniel to secure the vehicle and not speak about it further to anyone. Daniel agreed. He hung up. He stood in the yard. He thought about what Webb had said, and then he thought about the fact that he had already posted those photographs to a public-facing forum, and that 37 enthusiasts had already seen them. The information was not contained. It had never been contained from the moment he pressed the upload button. He understood this. He was not sure Marcus Webb understood this yet. By Thursday, 3 days after the auction, the online discussion had migrated from the forum into several other communities, and someone had screenshotted Daniel's post and shared it in a group dedicated to automotive mysteries with over 400,000 members. Photographs of the forum images were being shared on specialty websites. A British journalist had written a short piece under the headline, "Could a missing Whitmore prototype have surfaced in America?" without naming Daniel or his location, but with enough detail that anyone sufficiently motivated could have narrowed it down within hours. By Friday morning, there were journalists, not in person yet, but in his email and in his voicemail. 11 messages across 2 accounts he barely used. He had not responded to any of them. But the attention had reached somewhere closer to home. A man Daniel had never seen before rang his front doorbell on Friday afternoon, in the middle of the day while Lily was at school and Daniel was in the garage with the hood up, his arms inside the engine bay. He answered the door with engine grease on both forearms and found a man who was compact and well-groomed and wearing a jacket that was too expensive for the neighborhood, the kind of jacket that had been bought to project a specific image to a specific audience and was doing its job. He introduced himself with a first name only Michael and said he represented a private buyer who was very interested in the vehicle in Daniel's garage. He smiled throughout this introduction. He was the kind of person who smiled the way other people use punctuation not to express warmth, but to mark the end of a statement. The offer was $500,000. Payable in certified funds within 24 hours. He slid a business card through the screen door. Daniel looked at the card. He looked at the man. He said he wasn't selling. The man nodded, thanked him, and left without another word. Daniel watched the man's car pull away a rental, he noticed. Agency plates, no personalization, and then he locked the front door, walked through the house, and locked the side door to the garage. He went back to the engine bay but could not concentrate. He kept looking at the side door. That night, something woke him at 2:15. Not a loud sound, a soft one. The particular quality of silence that follows a sound. He lay still for a moment. He got up. He went to Lily's room first and stood in the doorway until he heard her breathing, regular and deep. He went downstairs. He checked the garage from inside. The car was there. Everything was where it belonged. He was about to go back upstairs when he noticed that the small box he had used to store the documents from the hidden compartment was sitting at a slightly different angle than he had left it. He opened it. The documents were gone. The photograph was gone. The pocket watch was still there, too recognizable. Probably too risky to take. Everything else, gone. He stood in his garage in the middle of the night with an empty box in his hands. And for the first time in this entire experience, he felt something he recognized as genuine fear, not for himself, but for Lily, asleep upstairs, and for the question of what it meant that someone had been inside his house while they slept and had left again without waking either of them. He called Marcus Webb. Webb answered on the second ring despite the hour, and listened without interrupting. When Daniel finished, Webb said, quietly and precisely, "I want you to know that this does not diminish the car's significance. The documents were confirmatory, not constitutive. The car itself is the evidence. But Daniel, you need to move the vehicle to a secure facility tonight." Daniel found out, 2 days later, that the man who had come to his door with the $500,000 offer was acting on behalf of a European collector who maintained an acquisition team that operated, to put it generously, in a gray area of automotive procurement. This was not the first time they had approached a private owner under pressure, and they were not the only interested party who had been watching Daniel's garage. Marcus Webb arrived in a car. Daniel hadn't expected not the helicopter he'd half anticipated, but a rented silver sedan, practical and anonymous. He was in his late 60s, thin, with the precise movements of someone who had spent decades handling objects that did not forgive carelessness. He walked around the Aston Martin 3 times, without saying a word. He crouched at each wheel arch. He produced a small flashlight and examined the interior through the driver's window before touching the door handle. Then he stood upright, put the flashlight away, and said, "I need to contact 3 people before I can tell you with certainty what this is, but I can tell you what I believe it is, and I want you to brace yourself." He believed the car was one of between 1 and 3 vehicles commissioned in the early 1960s by the British government through an intermediary specifically for intelligence-related use, not the theatrical version of such vehicles that later appeared in popular culture. The real version. Unregistered, undocumented, in any public record. Built to specifications that went beyond what Aston Martin's standard coachwork could provide. Whitmore had been the collector intermediary who had overseen the commission and, for reasons lost to history, had kept the vehicle rather than delivering it. The chassis number's absence from any registry was not an error. It had been deliberately omitted. The car was, in the most literal sense, a ghost. And there was only one of it. Daniel heard all of this leaning against his workbench with his arms folded, and when Webb finished, he said, "Is any of this provable?" Webb almost smiled. "That," he said, "is the correct question." Over the following 4 days, 3 experts were brought in under non-disclosure agreements, negotiated by a solicitor Webb brought with him. An automotive metallurgist, a coachwork historian with a specialty in British custom bodywork from the 1950s and 60s, and a retired archivist from a government records office who did not give his full name and who spent 45 minutes with the car and then 45 minutes alone with Marcus Webb in a conversation that Daniel was not part of. The archivist left without saying goodbye, but the following morning, Webb came to Daniel's kitchen where Lily was eating cereal and doing a crossword puzzle from a book she'd gotten at the library, and said that the archivist had provided a verbal confirmation that corroborated vehicle's origin. The coachwork historian had certified it as genuinely hand-built to bespoke specification in the early 1960s. The metallurgist had dated the alloys to within a margin consistent with that era. "We have enough," Webb said, "to proceed." Daniel looked across the table at Lily. Lily looked up from her crossword. "Does this mean we're rich now?" she asked. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Not until it's real," he said. Daniel was still eating instant noodles at 9 o'clock that evening while the valuation team was working 3 rooms away. He had bought 3 packets that morning because they were on sale, and he still had almost no money. And this fundamental reality had not changed regardless of what was happening in his garage. He ate the noodles at the kitchen sink, looking at the photograph of Rachel on the windowsill, and he thought, "If you could see this right now, you would not believe it either." A major international auction house reached out to Webb on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, they had proposed terms. By Friday, the auction was scheduled for the following Saturday, 9 days away, to be held at a dedicated venue with simultaneous remote bidding, open to registered international buyers. The pre-auction press release went out that evening. By midnight, it had been picked up by automotive media on 4 continents. By morning, it was in the mainstream press. "The man who bought trash for $200, one headline read, and Daniel saw it on his phone while standing in line at a grocery store, and felt something complicated that was not quite pride and not quite embarrassment but somewhere between the two. The week before the auction was not the triumphant week Daniel had imagined. He was moved to a hotel. The auction house arranged it, insisting that his personal security was now a matter they took seriously, and Lily came with him, which she found genuinely exciting because the hotel had a pool and room service and a television that worked on the first try. Daniel found it disorienting. He had been given a single suit by a stylist the auction house sent, because they had a press conference scheduled and did not want their consignor to appear in a jacket with a torn elbow. He wore the suit and answered questions in a room full of cameras and felt, through the entire experience, like a man playing a role in someone else's story. He was calm with the press because he was always calm. He said less than they wanted and more than was strategic. Someone asked him what it felt like to go from $200 to a potential 8-figure sale, and he said, "It doesn't feel like anything yet. Ask me after." This was not a prepared answer. It was simply the truth. On the Wednesday before the auction, a man approached Daniel in the hotel lobby. Not threatening, careful, polished, with the practiced warmth of someone who negotiated for a living. He introduced himself as a representative of a private buyer who, for reasons of discretion, preferred not to participate in a public auction. The offer he presented was $5 million, transferable within 48 hours, with no publicity No press, no record beyond what was legally required. Daniel looked at the man. He thought about the nights of instant noodles. He thought about the permission slip still in his jacket pocket, which he had still not signed because he kept forgetting that the school trip was now, financially, not a problem. He thought about all of it. Then he thanked the man for his time and told him he would be letting the auction proceed. The man nodded once, said he understood, and walked away. That night, Daniel received a call from the auction house's head of security telling him that the Aston Martin was gone. The word gone did not compute immediately. Daniel was standing in his hotel room in the suit he'd been given, holding the phone, and it took him several seconds to understand what the security director was telling him. The vehicle, which had been in a climate-controlled, secured facility under 24-hour guard and camera surveillance, was no longer in the facility. The cameras covering the loading bay had experienced a brief but targeted outage, 42 seconds, and in those 42 seconds, the car had been removed. The police were already on site. The auction house's legal team had been notified, and Daniel, the security director, said, should stay in his room. He did not stay in his room. He went to Lily's room first, woke her gently, and told her there was a problem with the car. She sat up immediately, the way children do when they sense genuine seriousness in an adult's voice. She did not cry. She looked at him and said, "What are we going to do?" He said he was working on it. He went back to his room and called every number he had. He called Marcus Webb. He called the auction house director. He called the detective who had introduced herself at the venue that afternoon as the lead investigator on the case. And then, at 1:40 in the morning, he received a text from a number he didn't recognize. A number he ran through a search engine and found belonged to a former apprentice mechanic who had worked with him briefly at the shop years ago, a young man named Tommy, who had since moved into the vehicle transport business. The text said only, "Check the transport yard cameras, not the venue cameras, the yard on Hendricks Avenue." Daniel forwarded the message to the detective. 40 minutes later, she called him back. The yard cameras had caught something. The venue cameras were positioned to miss a flatbed truck. Commercial plates, moving the car under cover of a tarp in the direction of the Eastern Freight District. By 4 in the morning, the police had identified the destination, a rented warehouse unit near the port, registered to a shell company that dissolved itself approximately 18 minutes before the police arrived at its registered address. The car was there, in the warehouse, intact. 3 men were detained at the scene. They were, as it turned out, not affiliated with the original buyer who had made offers. They were independent contractors hired through intermediaries, so insulated from each other that tracing the chain took investigators weeks and resolved in another country's jurisdiction. What Daniel learned from the detective's briefing and from what was recovered at the warehouse was that these men had not been after the car specifically. They had been after whatever remained in the hidden compartment. Whatever documentation they believed had not yet been photographed or disclosed. They had been hired by someone who believed the car's historical significance was tied not to its monetary value, but to something in those documents, something that went beyond automotive history. The detective looked at Daniel across a table at the police station at 6 in the morning and asked him if he had any idea what that might be. Daniel said, honestly, that he did not. The detective closed her notebook and said the car would be returned to the secure facility by 9. The auction was still on. Daniel did not sleep that night. He showered, put the suit back on, went to the hotel breakfast room at 7, and ordered eggs and toast and coffee, and ate all of it with the methodical focus of a man refueling before a long drive. Lily came down at 8 in her school clothes. She had packed them, she explained, because she thought the auction might be like a formal event, and she wanted to look like she belonged there. He looked at his daughter in her school blazer sitting across from him in a hotel breakfast room on one of the stranger mornings of both their lives, and he felt something vast and warm move through him that he could not name but did not need to. The auction venue was a converted hall in the financial district, high-ceilinged, all glass and pale stone, the kind of space that money builds to remind itself it exists. The floors were polished concrete. The lighting was designed to be flattering in photographs. There were staff, in matching black suits, moving through the room with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this many times and understood that the details mattered: the temperature of the room, the placement of the chairs, the exact angle of the projection screens. By 10 in the morning, it was full, not audience full, attendee full. This was not a spectator event. Everyone in the room had a reason to be there. Collectors who had flown in from Riyadh, London, Tokyo, New York, some of them on private aircraft, some of them unknown to each other but known to the auction house's research team, representatives of private buyers who preferred not to appear personally, sitting with phones in hand and clear lines of communication to whoever was writing the checks. Members of the press confined to a gallery above the floor, where they had cameras and no paddles. A delegation from an automotive museum in Stuttgart who had requested cataloging access, and scattered through the room, in the deliberate way of people who did not want to be associated with each other in photographs, the actual bidders, 12 registered. The auction house had told Daniel, with verified financial capability and confirmed reserves. He had been given that number 48 hours before the event and had not known what to do with it. 12 people who could spend enough to change his daughter's entire life. He sat in a chair to the side of the room with Lily beside him, their chairs slightly angled so they could see the screen showing the car, which was not physically present, too risky now after the theft, displayed instead in high-resolution projection from multiple angles by a specialist photography team, and Lily held his hand, not nervously, firmly, like she was the one steadying him, and perhaps she was. The auctioneer was a woman named Helena Price, who had been running major sales for over 30 years and whose reputation in the industry was for exactly one quality. She did not hurry. She opened the session without pageantry, gave a 3-minute provenance summary in a measured voice, and opened bidding at $1 million. The room moved immediately, 1 million to 1.5, 1.5 to 2, 2 to 2.8. The pace was faster than Daniel had expected. Helena had been right that this car would generate aggressive early movement. By the time the bidding reached 4 million, the field had narrowed to 5 participants. By 6 million, it was 3. By 8 million, it was 2. A representative bidding on behalf of an American collector whose identity had not been disclosed, and a man seated 3 rows back who had flown in from the Middle East and was bidding in person, his paddle raised with an absolute stillness that suggested he had done this before and intended to finish it. Daniel's hand was cold. He didn't realize this until Lily reached over and wrapped both her hands around his. She was watching the screen. Her face was perfectly composed. 8.5, 9, 9.4. The American representative conferred briefly with someone on a phone. The room was quiet enough that the sound of Helena Price's breathing was audible between bids. 9.8. Then the man 3 rows back raised his paddle unhurried, deliberate, and said, in a voice that carried without effort, $10 million. Helena Price waited the required time. She looked at the American representative. The representative was on his phone. 30 seconds. The paddle did not go up. Helena Price raised her gavel. She looked at the room. She brought the gavel down. The sound was not loud. But no one in the room had ever heard a room go quite so quiet, so quickly, in response to a single wooden strike. Daniel did not make a sound. He sat very still. Lily turned to look at him. His eyes were full, and he was not going to be the man who cried in a room full of people, but he was also not going to succeed at not crying, and he understood this about himself in that moment with complete clarity. Lily let go of his hand and put her arms around him instead, her head against his shoulder, and she said it quietly, right against the fabric of the borrowed suit. Mom would be so proud of you, Dad. He held his daughter in that glass and stone room with the weight of $10 million in years of silence, and one rust-covered car and a small key found in a door handle all condensed into a single moment, and he let himself cry, just briefly, just enough, and then he straightened up and nodded, and looked at the projection of the Aston Martin on the screen, perfect in high resolution, finally seen. That was when Marcus Webb appeared at his elbow and said, in the understated tone of a man who had been waiting to say this for days, "The car wasn't the real treasure, you know." Daniel looked at him. Then, what was? Webb reached into his jacket and produced a folded paper, a copy of a page from one of the documents that had been stolen and then recovered when the warehouse was searched. He had not shown this to Daniel before. This, he said, is a letter written by Whitmore, probably in the early 1970s. Shortly before he died, he held it out. Daniel took it. The letter was not long. 3 paragraphs in a careful hand that had grown slightly less steady toward the bottom of the page, as though it had been written all at once, quickly, with something pressing. The first paragraph described the car, its commission, its purpose, the reasons it had never been delivered. The second paragraph described Whitmore's decision to keep it hidden, to let the world believe it was lost, because he had grown to distrust the intentions of the people who had originally commissioned it. But it was the third paragraph that Marcus Webb had wanted Daniel to read. It read, "In the language of a man who had spent his life among rare and beautiful things, and understood what made something truly valuable, I have hidden this because I have learned that value is not determined by the market, nor by provenance, nor by age or rarity alone. True value, the kind that cannot be appraised or auctioned, is only visible to people who still believe that something discarded is not something destroyed. I do not know who will find this. I suspect it will be someone who needed to find it. I hope they understand what I am trying to say. The car was always a test. The treasure was always the person who chose to look." Daniel read it twice. He folded it carefully along the original crease and handed it back to Marcus Webb. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I want to keep this." Webb nodded and handed him the copy. In the weeks that followed, Daniel Carter's life changed in ways that were both dramatic and, to those who knew him, entirely predictable. He paid off every debt, the back rent, the medical bills that had accumulated during Rachel's illness, and that he had been quietly servicing for 3 years, the small loans from friends that he had always been too proud to let go unacknowledged. He bought a house, not a large one, not an extravagant one, a solid 2-story, on a tree-lined street, with a proper garage, and a yard large enough for Lily to have a garden if she wanted one, which she immediately decided she did. He signed Lily's permission slip for the science trip, which had long since passed but whose teacher accepted his retroactive contribution to the class fund, with more grace than Daniel had expected. He enrolled Lily in a better school, and then felt guilty about it, and then accepted that wanting better things for your child is not a thing that requires guilt. He opened a garage, not a commercial operation, a small, clean workshop in the building behind his new house, with a proper lift and good lighting, and the tool set he rebuilt from scratch over the course of 2 months. He put a sign above the door. Hand-lettered on wood he cut himself. The sign said, "Carter's no job too gone." He began accepting work from people in the neighborhood who couldn't afford what the commercial shops charged. Single mothers whose check engine lights had been on for 8 months because they couldn't risk the diagnostic fee. Elderly men and women on fixed incomes whose mechanics had told them their cars weren't worth fixing. College students driving vehicles that everyone told them to scrap. Daniel worked on every one of them with the same patience and the same methodology, the belief that something broken was not necessarily something finished. He kept one thing from the Aston Martin, not the watch, which was sold separately at a specialist auction for a sum that covered Lily's education through university, not the documents, which went to a British automotive archive with appropriate ceremony. He kept the badge. The small, handmade logo from the grille, the one that had first caught his eye in that salvage yard. The subtle wrongness of it that told him something was different about this car. He mounted it on the wall of the garage, above the lift, where the light caught it well. Lily helped him hang it, standing on a step stool, holding the level while he marked the pilot holes. Months later, on a Saturday morning, Daniel was under a 1998 pickup truck that belonged to a teacher named Mrs. Holloway, replacing a worn-out exhaust system, when he heard a knock at the open garage door. He slid out from under the truck and found a boy standing in the doorway, 12, maybe 13, in a jacket too thin for the weather, and behind him, on the driveway apron, a bicycle, not just old, destroyed, both tires flat, the chain gone, the handlebars bent at an angle that suggested an encounter with something immovable. Lily was in the yard nearby and had already come over, the way she always did when someone new appeared at the garage. The boy said his name was Marcus, a coincidence that Daniel noted privately with a quiet amusement, and that he'd found the bike in a dumpster and wanted to know if it could be fixed. He had $3. Mrs. Holloway had emerged from the waiting chair inside, and now stood in the garage door behind the boy, and looked at the bicycle with the expression of someone who had formed a clear opinion about its prospects. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag. He walked to the driveway and crouched beside the bicycle, examining it with the same quiet attention he had once applied to a rust-covered car in a salvage yard. The frame was sound. The components were damaged but salvageable. The wheels needed new tubes and the chain needed replacing, but neither of those things was expensive. He looked up at the boy. He looked past the boy at Mrs. Holloway, who was still wearing the expression. He stood up. He said, "Mrs. Holloway, what do you think of this bike?" She looked at it steadily and said, with conviction, "It's junk." Daniel looked at the bike again. Lily appeared at his shoulder. She was watching her father's face, and she already knew what he was going to say, and she was smiling because she knew. Daniel looked at the boy. He said, "Maybe. Maybe not." He told Marcus to come back Saturday morning. He'd have the bike ready, no charge. The boy left. Mrs. Holloway went back inside. Lily stayed where she was, looking at her father in the morning light. Daniel looked back at his daughter, this 10-year-old who had pushed her dinner across the table so her father could eat, who had said her mother always told her he could fix anything, who had held his hand through the longest 14 days of both their lives. He thought about the letter in Whitmore's handwriting. He thought about a car that no one had wanted, sitting in the corner of a yard while everyone looked somewhere else. He thought about what it means to still believe in something after the world has finished dismissing it. The Aston Martin badge on the wall of the garage caught the morning light and held it there, quiet and gold, above everything he had built. He picked up his tools and went back to work. The junkyard smelled like rust and rain, and Marcus Hale stood in the middle of it with $500 in his hand and nowhere else left to go. He was 38 years old. His work boots had a hole in the left sole. His jacket had a tear along the shoulder that he'd patched twice with electrical tape, and the tape had started peeling again somewhere around November. People who looked at Marcus Hale on that particular Tuesday morning saw a man who had already lost a man whose posture carried the weight of a mortgage he couldn't pay, a car that had finally quit on him at the worst possible moment, and a daughter at home who needed breakfast and didn't know the electricity bill was 3 months overdue. What those people didn't see was what Marcus saw every single morning when he looked in the cracked bathroom mirror: a father. That was the only identity that still held. His wife, Claire, had been gone 4 years. Cancer, the slow kind. The kind that gives you enough time to say goodbye but not enough time to figure out how to actually survive after. She'd passed on a Wednesday in February, and Marcus remembered the specific quality of the light that day, gray and thin, like the sky itself was tired. Lily had been 4 years old. She'd stood at the foot of the hospital bed in pink sneakers and hadn't cried, not because she didn't understand, but because children that age understand everything and nothing at once. Marcus had held it together in that room and fallen apart in the parking garage stairwell where no one could hear him. He'd been holding it together in various stairwells ever since. He worked 3 jobs at the peak of it: delivery driver at night, stock clerk at a grocery warehouse 2 mornings a week, and occasional handyman work whenever a neighbor posted something on the community board. He was good with engines. He always had been. His father had taught him before the old man's hands went bad with arthritis, and Marcus had kept that knowledge the way you keep something irreplaceable, carefully, quietly, always within reach. But the delivery job was gone now. His car, a 2008 sedan with 190,000 miles on it, had given up the ghost on Route 9 at 11:40 on a Monday night. And his dispatcher had told him, not unkindly, that they needed drivers with reliable vehicles. That was the language of the working world. Reliable. As though reliability was a thing you chose rather than a thing you either had the money to maintain or didn't. Marcus had been given his final paycheck by direct deposit and a voicemail that wished him luck. He'd listened to the voicemail twice and then deleted it. His friend Darnell had told him to use the $500 on groceries and overdue bills. His neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had said the same thing, more gently, over a cup of coffee she'd brought uninvited to his door because she could read the particular slant of his shoulders. They were both right. It was the sensible thing. It was the safe thing. Marcus knew it. He bought the car anyway. It sat in the far corner of Ridley's Auto Salvage, like something that had given up trying to look like a car. The body was a faded burgundy, sun-bleached to something closer to the color of dried brick. The passenger side mirror was gone. 3 of the 4 hubcaps were missing. The interior had been partially stripped. The rear seat was there, but the dashboard panels had been removed along one side, exposing wiring that someone had neatly bundled with zip ties, which struck Marcus as strange. You didn't strip a car neatly unless you knew what you were doing, and you were being careful about it. Earl Ridley, who ran the yard and had been running it since the Reagan administration, shrugged when Marcus asked about the history, said it came in off a tow from the interstate about 6 weeks back. Driver wasn't with the vehicle. He'd waved a hand vaguely when Marcus pressed for more. The car had been sitting long enough that Earl was losing yard space, which was the only reason the price was $500 instead of $1,200. Engine turns over, Earl had said. That's more than I can promise about half the cars in here. And then, scratching his chin, tell you what, if that thing runs longer than 3 days without dying on you, I'll give your $500 back. He said it the way men say things they know they'll never have to make good on. Marcus had shaken his hand anyway. The drive home was slow and cautious. Marcus keeping the car at 40 miles per hour and listening to every sound the engine made the way. You listened to a new conversation carefully, cataloging. What he heard surprised him. Under all the cosmetic ruin, the engine ran smooth. Smoother than it had any right to. When he popped the hood in his building's parking lot and looked at the engine block with a flashlight, he found what he'd suspected: the engine had been worked on recently, and worked on well. Modified, even. Certain components replaced with better parts than the car's model year would have originally carried. Someone with real knowledge had gotten under this hood and done serious work. That same careful, intentional quality that showed in the bundled wiring showed in the engine. This car had been prepared for something. Marcus didn't know what. He stood in the parking lot for a long time in the cold, trying to puzzle it out, and then he went upstairs to make Lily dinner. It was Lily who found the compartment. She was 8 years old and had her mother's eyes and her mother's habit of touching things to understand them, running her fingers along surfaces, knocking on walls to hear what was hollow. She was sitting in the back seat the next afternoon, narrating an imaginary road trip for her stuffed rabbit, when she pressed her palm flat against the floor panel under the rear seat and heard the difference in the sound. She told her father, in that matter-of-fact way children report miraculous things. "Dad, this part is fake." Marcus had reached under and found the release, a small magnetic latch, invisible unless you knew exactly where to press. The compartment beneath was shallow, barely 2 inches deep, but it was there, and inside it were 2 things. A clear plastic sleeve containing a folded document printed in a font too small to read without good light, and a USB drive with a cracked casing, as though it had been stepped on or dropped from a height, and survived, just barely. Beside the USB, scratched directly into the metal floor of the compartment, in something sharp, a key, maybe, or a nail, were 9 words. "If I die, do not trust Evelyn Carter." Marcus sat in the car for a long time looking at those words. Then he looked up Carter Tech on his phone. He recognized the name. Anyone who read the news recognized the name. Carter Tech was one of the largest private technology firms in the country. Artificial intelligence infrastructure, data management systems, government contracts. Evelyn Carter, its founder and chief executive, was 44 years old and had appeared on the covers of more business publications than Marcus could count in the 10 seconds he spent scrolling. She was described in every profile as controlled, brilliant, and formidable. The press called her the Iron Woman of Wall Street. though her company was technically headquartered in the city rather than on the street itself. She had a daughter, according to one profile, a 10-year-old named Sophie. There was one photograph of Sophie, clearly taken without full consent, showing a small girl in a school uniform looking sideways at the camera, with an expression that was already practiced in the art of not giving anything away. Daughter of the Iron Woman. Marcus felt something he couldn't name when he looked at that photograph, something between pity and recognition. Across the city, in a glass and steel tower that occupied an entire block of the financial district, Evelyn Carter was on her fourth call of the evening, having been on calls since 6 in the morning with breaks only for coffee and a 12-minute lunch eaten at her desk without tasting it. The merger was the size of a small country's annual budget, and the board wanted it completed before the fiscal quarter closed, and there were 17 distinct points of legal contention that each needed resolution before the documents could be signed, and Evelyn Carter was the only person in any of the rooms who could hold all 17 in her head simultaneously while conducting a negotiation. She was that kind of mind, the kind that processes parallel threads without losing the through line, that finds the pattern in noise others experience only as noise. It was the quality that had made her company, and it was the quality that had cost her, over the years, a marriage, 3 close friendships, and the particular irretrievable kind of time that you do not realize you are spending until it is already spent. Her assistant knocked at 7:40 and said her daughter's school had called. Again, Sophie had been removed from the afternoon equestrian session after telling her instructor, with complete composure, that the program was pedagogically unsound. The instructor had been offended. The school's coordinator had been diplomatic. Evelyn had told her assistant to send flowers to the instructor and to schedule a call with the coordinator for tomorrow morning, and then had felt, as she returned to her documents, the specific quality of guilt that comes from handling your child the same way you handle a vendor dispute. Sophie was 10. Sophie had her father's mouth and Evelyn's eyes, and a habit of going very still in large social situations that Evelyn recognized as her own, inherited and now belonging to the next generation. She loved her daughter with a ferocity that sat entirely below the surface, that she had never been entirely sure she had communicated. The security detail she'd assigned to Sophie 3 months ago, 2 former federal agents, rotating shifts, a protocol so airtight it had earned the nickname the Perimeter among the men who ran it, was, in some ways, the most legible language of love she knew. She had been told, by a therapist she'd seen twice, and then stopped seeing because the sessions conflicted with a board meeting, that this was avoidant attachment expressed through infrastructure. She had not disagreed. What Evelyn did not know, in that glass tower, reviewing merger documents with her 4th coffee going cold beside her keyboard, was that the meeting she would have with a deliveryman from the South Side in approximately 72 hours would be the most consequential meeting of her adult life. She did not know that someone in her organization had been watching a salvage yard on the East Side with the specific anxiety of a man who has lost something critical and has not yet confirmed whether it is truly gone. And she did not know that a man she had never met had spent his last $500 on the vehicle that carried the proof of everything Walsh had worked so carefully to bury. She was good at anticipating threats. She was very good, but she had anticipated them from directions she understood: competitors, regulators, market forces, the press. She had not anticipated the direction from which this particular truth was going to arrive. The drive was cracked, but not dead. It opened as read-only, and most of the files were corrupted or encrypted blocks of characters that resolved into nothing legible. But one folder had survived. Inside it was a single video file, 7 minutes and 40 seconds long, partially corrupted at the end, so that the final minute cut to static. The man on the screen was seated at a desk in what looked like a home office. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, with the kind of face that would have been easy to trust: open, tired, careful. He identified himself at the start of the recording: Daniel Ross, Senior Systems Engineer, Carter Tech. He spoke quietly, with the precision of a man who has rehearsed what he's saying because he knows he may not get another chance to say it. What he described, in the 7 minutes before the static swallowed his voice, was a surveillance system. Not the ordinary kind. a passive data collection architecture embedded in Carter Tech's flagship municipal infrastructure software that was currently operating in 14 American cities, processing traffic systems, utility grids, emergency dispatch. The embedded layer, Daniel said, collected behavioral data on individuals at scale, without disclosure, without consent, and without any legal authorization whatsoever. And the board of directors, not Evelyn Carter, but the board that surrounded her, had entered into a preliminary agreement to sell access to that data stream to a foreign intelligence entity whose name was redacted in the video, but whose logo, visible for 2 frames on a document Daniel held up to the camera, Marcus did not recognize. Daniel said he had brought his concerns to 2 board members and been dismissed. He said he had then compiled evidence and taken it to an attorney. He said he was recording this video because he was afraid. The video cut out before he said what he was afraid of specifically, but the sentence he'd scratched into the floor of the car answered that question well enough. Marcus sat in the kitchen for a long time after the video ended. He was not a man given to panic. Panic required a surplus of energy that single fathers doing 3 jobs didn't generally have, but his hands were not entirely steady when he closed the laptop. He thought about calling the police, and then he thought about what a man with $500 and an eviction notice on his second warning was likely to be told when he walked into a police station claiming to have evidence against a billion-dollar technology company. He thought about the scratched words in the car's floor. He thought about Daniel Ross, whose name he now searched and found in a single news brief from 14 months ago, a traffic accident on a rural highway, ruled accidental, no other vehicles involved. He looked at the photograph that accompanied the brief. The face matched the man in the video. He didn't sleep much. In the morning, he dropped Lily at school, came home, and sat at the kitchen table, trying to think through what to do. An hour later, he got up to go to the bathroom, and when he came back, the front door was open. He had locked it. He was certain he had locked it. He ran through the apartment in 4 seconds, checked every room, looked under every piece of furniture large enough to conceal a child, and found nothing. Lily's room was empty. Her backpack was at school. Her rabbit was on the bed. Marcus stood in the center of his daughter's room and felt the entire world drop away beneath his feet. The call came 40 minutes later, from a number he didn't recognize. A man's voice, flat and businesslike. Bring the car to an address on the east side of the industrial district. Come alone. Come now. Marcus drove. He had no other choice. He had exactly 1 speed on that drive, which was controlled and forward, because the alternative, the shaking, the spiral, the terror, was not something he could afford until Lily was safe. When he reached the address, a loading dock behind a closed printing facility, he found 2 men he'd never seen before, and his daughter, sitting on a metal crate, eating a granola bar. Lily looked at her father with the expression of someone who has decided not to be frightened until she sees whether her father is frightened first. Marcus had kept his face still for her sake. For his sake, for whatever both of them had left. The men were not, it turned out, the kind of people who hurt children. They were the kind of people who operated in the margins of larger problems, hired not for violence but for information retrieval. They'd taken Lily not to harm her, but to ensure Marcus's cooperation. And once they'd confirmed that he genuinely had no idea what was in the car when he bought it, that he was exactly what he appeared to be, a desperate man who'd made an impractical purchase, they released her without ceremony. One of the men, the shorter one, looked at Marcus before leaving and said, without particular emotion, "If the people at the top of Carter Tech find out you have that car, both of you are dead." Then they got in their vehicle and left. Marcus stood with Lily pressed against his chest for a long time, her small hands gripping his jacket. And neither of them said anything for a while. He drove home slowly. He put Lily to bed early, telling her it was an adventure, and that adventures sometimes included granola bars in unusual places. She didn't entirely believe him. She was 8, not 4, but she went along with it because she trusted him, and because children understand more than adults give them credit for and choose, sometimes, to let the adult have the story they need. That night, Marcus turned on the local news while he was washing dishes, not really watching. and then the anchor said a name that made him stop. Sophie Carter. 10 years old. Missing. Last seen leaving a private academy in the Upper District. Carter Tech's security detail, which had been accompanying the girl, had reported losing contact with her vehicle in the area near the highway interchange during the storm. Police were asking for information. The photograph they showed was the same one Marcus had seen, that sideways glance, that practiced guardedness. He stood with his hands still in the soapy water and looked at the television screen for a long time. The storm had come in off the coast that evening, faster than predicted. The kind of storm that makes meteorologists issue corrections and apologies simultaneously. Marcus had gone back out at 10 o'clock, not because he still had his delivery job, he didn't, but because Mrs. Patterson upstairs had needed medication from the 24-hour pharmacy and was afraid to drive in the weather, and Marcus was not the kind of man who said no to that. He was on the elevated interstate, the rain coming sideways across the windshield, when he saw the SUV. It was moving wrong, not damaged, not stalled, but not moving under its own driver's will either. There was a second vehicle alongside it, a dark sedan running without lights, and the SUV was being herded toward the right shoulder. Marcus understood what he was seeing. In the same moment, he recognized the corporate insignia on the SUV's rear panel. Carter Tech's fleet. He'd seen the logo in the car's compartment. On the tow receipt Earl had shoved in the glove box without thinking. He'd been looking at that logo for 3 days. He had a fraction of a second to decide. He had always heard that these moments were slow, that adrenaline elongated time into something navigable. It was not slow. It was a single compressed instant in which he saw everything at once: the rain on the windshield, the dark sedan's angle, the SUV's rear tires losing traction on the wet surface, the guardrail toward which the vehicle was being pushed, and then he saw Lily's face, which was not there but was always there, and he thought of the man in the video saying quietly that he was afraid. And he thought of 9 words scratched into metal by someone who had chosen to trust the truth to whatever came next. He thought of a 10-year-old girl in a school uniform with a practiced, guarded expression, and no idea that the world her mother had built for her was full of cracks. He thought of Daniel Ross on a rural highway, alone. Marcus pressed the accelerator. What happened next was something he would spend a long time afterward trying to explain, and never entirely succeeding. The sedan, the broken down, stripped out, $500 piece of salvaged metal accelerated like nothing he'd ever driven. Not like an old car running on borrowed time, like something engineered. The modifications under the hood, the ones he'd noticed but not fully understood, delivered power that had no business coming from that chassis. He used the car as a wedge, positioning it between the herding vehicle and the SUV, forcing a gap, absorbing the impact of the dark sedan's attempt to correct its course. The crash was not catastrophic. Controlled is a better word, if barely. The herding vehicle lost control on the wet pavement and struck the barrier wall. The SUV came to rest on the shoulder with 2 flat tires and a crumpled panel. Marcus sat in his car for 3 seconds, listening to his own breathing. Then he got out into the rain. Sophie Carter was in the back seat of the SUV. The driver was unconscious, but breathing head wound from the airbag. Serious, but not immediately fatal. Sophie was shaken but unhurt, pressed into the corner of the seat with her knees drawn up and her eyes open very wide. She looked at Marcus the way her mother's photograph had suggested she might look at most things, with wariness and assessment running simultaneously. He told her his name. He said she was safe. He said he was going to call for help, and she should stay in the vehicle, she said. In a voice steadier than most adults could have managed in the same situation. You should know that the people who did this work for my mother's company. Then she looked past Marcus at the car idling on the shoulder with its headlights cutting through the rain, and something changed in her expression. I've seen that car before, she said quietly. It was in the parking structure at Carter Tech. About a year ago, it was Dr. Ross's car. The police came. Paramedics came. 2 unmarked cars came very quickly after, carrying men in suits who spoke quietly into earpieces and took Sophie away before Marcus could say another word to her. An officer took his statement. Marcus gave the basic facts and omitted the compartment and the USB and the 9 scratched words, because the men in suits had looked at him with the kind of eyes that do a calculation, and he did not yet know whose side the calculation came out on. He drove home in the rain with a cracked headlight and a dented right quarter panel, and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before going inside. Evelyn Carter came to him. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected, if anything, to receive a formal communication from a legal team, or perhaps nothing at all. The powerful have many ways of managing the inconvenient. But she came herself, the following morning, with a driver who waited outside and no visible security. She was taller than her photographs suggested. She wore a gray coat that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly rent, and she held herself with the particular stillness of someone who is accustomed to filling a room by occupying the center of it. She looked at the $500 sedan parked in the spot beside Marcus's building, and her composure, which was considerable, did something almost imperceptible at the edges. "That's Daniel's car," she said. Not a question. The conversation in Marcus's kitchen was not comfortable. Evelyn Carter was not a comfortable person. She asked questions with the directness of someone who has learned that directness is faster and less painful in the long run than any other approach, and Marcus answered them with the same quality of directness, because he was tired and because he was not, despite everything, afraid of her. He was angry, which is different. He told her about the compartment, the document, the USB, the video. He did not tell her everything immediately. He watched her face while he told her, watching for calculation, for performance, for the specific flatness that falls over a guilty face, receiving information it already possesses. What he saw instead was something that looked genuinely like a person being struck by something they had not prepared for. Her hands, folded on the table in front of her, went very still. That was all, but it was enough. He continued. Evelyn Carter had not known. That was the truth of it. And Marcus came to believe it. And not only because she said so, the surveillance architecture Daniel Ross had documented had been developed and implemented under the authority of the board's technology committee, a subcommittee chaired by the company's vice president, a man named Griffin Walsh, who had managed the project with a degree of structural insulation that had kept it entirely outside Evelyn's operational purview. Evelyn had been the public face, the vision, the intellectual center of Carter Tech. Walsh had been the infrastructure, and Walsh had understood, for the 3 years the program had been operational, that the program's existence was the one thing that could destroy not just his position but the company itself, and possibly land him in federal custody. When Daniel Ross had gone to 2 board members with his concerns, those board members had gone to Walsh. Walsh had handled it. The road accident on the rural highway had been handled. The car, which Daniel had used to transport physical copies of the documentation because he didn't trust digital transfer, had been sent to impound under a false name and eventually auctioned to a salvage yard because Walsh had assumed the documentation was either destroyed in the accident or already recovered. It hadn't been. It had been sitting under the back seat of a stripped-down sedan in Earl Ridley's lot, waiting for a man with $500 and no other options to walk in off the street. Evelyn wanted to buy the car. She offered $1 million, which she stated without theater. The way you state the price of a thing you intend to purchase. Marcus said no. He looked at her across the kitchen table, with its mismatched chairs and its surface worn soft from years of homework and breakfast, and the accumulated domestic texture of a life lived on no margin at all, and he said no. Not because the money wasn't real to him. $1 million would have ended every specific fear he'd been carrying for 4 years, but he understood that if he sold her the car and the evidence in it, the shape of what happened next was entirely in her hands. And whatever Evelyn Carter was brilliant, cold, capable, and quite possibly innocent of what her company had done, she was still the most powerful person in any room she entered. Marcus had spent his life in rooms where the most powerful person's interests determined the outcome. He wasn't going to take that bet. He told her this plainly, without apology, and watched her process it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, almost to herself, Daniel was right to record that video. That night, someone ran Marcus's car off the road. He was driving home from a gas station, 2 miles from his building, when a black SUV with no plates came out of a side street and hit the sedan on the driver's side with enough force to send it onto the shoulder and into the guardrail. The sedan's reinforced frame, one of Daniel's modifications, Marcus later understood kept the cabin intact. He was concussed, his right arm cut from the shattered window, his ribs badly bruised on the left side where the door compressed. He climbed out of the wreck onto the dark shoulder of the road and sat on the guardrail in the cold for a moment. The SUV was gone. He called Evelyn because she was the only person in his phone who had the kind of resources to respond to what had just happened. And because Lily was at Sophie's, the two girls having been placed together at Evelyn's house while the situation was being assessed, and he needed to know they were safe. They were. Sophie had apparently decided that Lily was her responsibility and had been looking after her with the focused intensity of a child who does not often get to be responsible for something smaller than herself. Lily had apparently decided that Sophie was lonely in a way she recognized, and had given her the stuffed rabbit to hold. Marcus refused the hospital. He let Evelyn's driver take him to her house, where a company physician examined him, taped his ribs, cleaned the arm wound, and told him things he already knew about concussions in the language of professional understatement. He sat in Evelyn's living room, which was large and beautiful, and somehow less comfortable than his own kitchen, and looked at his daughter asleep on a sofa, with the rabbit tucked under her chin, and Sophie sitting cross-legged on the floor beside her, reading a book, having apparently appointed herself night watch. Evelyn came and stood beside him, and they both looked at the two girls without speaking for a moment. Evelyn said quietly, so as not to wake them, "I gave everything to build this company. I thought that was what strength looked like." Marcus said nothing. He was not a man who gave speeches, but after a moment he said, "Lily used to cry at night after Claire died. Every night, for a year, I would go in and sit on the floor beside her bed and just stay there until she went back to sleep. I didn't say anything most nights. She just needed to know I was there." Evelyn looked at Sophie for a long moment. Something shifted in her face that had nothing to do with calculation. "I've missed so much," she said. "I know," Marcus said. He wasn't being unkind. He was being honest. He was also being kind, in the way that honesty sometimes is. Walsh moved first. He had been monitoring the situation through sources within the company's security apparatus, and he understood that the combination of Evelyn's awareness and Marcus's possession of the Daniel Ross evidence was now an existential threat that had advanced past the point where it could be managed quietly. He had Lily and Sophie taken from the house during a window when the security detail was being rotated a gap of 11 minutes, which was enough. He delivered his terms through a proxy, the USB and all copies in exchange for the children, after which he intended to destroy the evidence, liquidate his offshore accounts, and disappear to a jurisdiction that did not extradite. He had a private flight leaving in 4 hours. Marcus drove. Evelyn was in the passenger seat, which was not a thing she had planned on, but Marcus had simply gotten in the driver's seat, and Evelyn had gotten in the other side, because the alternative was standing in her driveway while he went without her, and she was not made for standing still. The sedan moved through the city at speed, its modified engine quiet, and certain under Marcus's hands. He had taped his ribs tighter. His arm was bandaged to the elbow. He drove with the focus of a man who had been stripped down to his most essential components, the ones that mattered, the ones that ran clean even when everything else was gone. The data center was in an industrial district on the south side, a facility that officially processed logistics software and unofficially housed the surveillance architecture's primary servers. There was a gate. Marcus drove through it. The gate lost. The car barely noticed. What followed inside the facility was not cinematic in the way Marcus had seen in movies. It was faster and uglier and more frightening than that. There were 2 hired guards at the server room entrance. And Marcus had his size, and his years of physical work, and the specific advantage of a man with nothing left to lose, and Evelyn had her voice, and her authority, and the particular quality of fury that comes from a controlled person finally releasing the latch. Walsh was in the server room, working at a terminal, when they got the door open. He looked at Evelyn with the expression of a man who has run a careful calculation and is only now discovering an error in the formula. Evelyn had brought her own terminal, a tablet, pulled from her coat pocket, and she was already working. Daniel Ross, in his 14 months of preparation before his death, had built in a failsafe, a distributed upload protocol keyed to a specific sequence that could be triggered remotely, which he had shared with his attorney, who had contacted Evelyn 3 days ago when the story began breaking through the static. Walsh had not known about the attorney. That was the error in the formula. Evelyn triggered the protocol. The server room's network pushed its entire archive, all of it. Every transaction log, every data sharing agreement, every communication outward, simultaneously, to a list of recipients that included 3 federal agencies, 2 investigative journalism organizations, and a law firm specializing in whistleblower cases. Walsh moved toward the terminal to stop it. Marcus was between him and the terminal. Walsh made the calculation and sat down. Lily and Sophie had not been passive. They were in a storage room 2 corridors away, locked in by a man who had underestimated them on the basis of their age. Lily had found a fire suppression panel on the wall. She had her mother's hands, her father's attention to surfaces, and 8 years of being told that the answer to a problem is almost always already in the room with you. She tripped the suppression system in that corridor only, which triggered the facility's emergency unlock protocol on all interior doors, which was a safety feature Walsh had not thought to disable, because he'd had 4 hours, and 4 hours is not enough time to think of everything. The girls walked out into the corridor and found Marcus coming from the opposite direction, and Lily ran to him with the specific kind of full-body relief that a child reserves for the confirmation of a fear that is now, finally, resolved. He caught her with his good arm and held her with the grip of a man who has been afraid in the specific way. You are afraid when the thing most precious to you is out of your hands, and who is now, slowly, putting that fear down. The server room caught fire 15 minutes later, an electrical failure in the overloaded network hardware. The kind of thing that happens when you push an infrastructure past its designed capacity in a matter of minutes. The sprinkler system was already compromised from Lily's maneuver. Marcus had gotten everyone out. Evelyn had her evidence transmitted. Walsh was sitting on the ground outside the facility being spoken to by 2 federal agents who had arrived with impressive speed, which suggested they had been monitoring the situation for some time and had been waiting for exactly this kind of decisive, documentable moment. Marcus stood in the parking lot with Lily on his hip and watched the data center burn and thought about Daniel Ross, who had recorded a video in a home office with the quiet voice of a careful, frightened man and had put the evidence in the safest place he had available, the floor of a car. He thought about the 9 scratched words. He thought about $500 and a junkyard and a hole in his left boot sole. The sedan sat in the parking lot with a cracked headlight and a dented quarter panel and a gate-shaped impression across its front bumper, running clean. What followed was the kind of public unwinding that takes months and fills the background of ordinary life, like weather, always present, always moving, always somewhere between stages. Griffin Walsh was indicted on federal charges within 6 weeks, the charges detailed and specific in a way that left no interpretive room. 3 board members, who had known, or should have known, followed. The foreign intelligence entity, whose name was eventually published in full by the investigative outlet that received the transmitted archive, became the subject of diplomatic communications at a level that had nothing to do with Marcus Hale or the South Side or a salvage yard, but that had everything to do with Daniel Ross's quiet, frightened, methodical preparation 14 months before his death. The attorney Daniel had released a statement that was quoted in publications. Marcus had never expected to read and would not have found at the gas station where he used to buy his coffee before he had money for a better kind. The statement called Daniel Ross a man of extraordinary courage. Marcus agreed with that. He thought about it, sometimes, while he was working the specific courage it takes to record a video in a home office with no guarantee that anyone will ever watch it, and to trust that the truth has a kind of gravity that will eventually find its own level. No matter how long it takes, no matter what gets in the way. Carter Tech entered a period of supervised restructuring under a consent agreement with federal regulators. Evelyn Carter resigned the chief executive position voluntarily, which surprised the financial press and no one who had been paying attention to what the experience had done to her face, the particular softening of a person who has had their understanding of their own life corrected in a way that is painful and, ultimately, clarifying. She stayed involved in the company as a board member but began, for the first time in a decade, to be home before Sophie's bedtime most evenings. She was not, by nature, a warm person in the way that some people are warm. She didn't have the easy softness, the comfortable affect, but she was present, which was what Sophie had needed all along, and had been too careful and too proud to say. Marcus received a settlement from the Carter Tech Restructuring Fund, a figure large enough to change the shape of his life, arrived in a bank account that had previously held amounts ending in single digits. He stood at the ATM the day the funds cleared and looked at the balance on the screen for a long time. A woman behind him in line said, gently, that she needed to use the machine. He apologized and stepped aside. He sat in his car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to locate the feeling he'd expected to have, the relief, the release, the sense of the floor finally rising to meet him. It was there. It was real. But underneath it was something else, something quieter, which was the knowledge that the number on the screen had come from Daniel Ross's courage and from Earl Ridley's offhand willingness to sell an unloved car, and from Lily's hands against a floor panel, and from a GPS that still worked, and from a highway in a storm where he'd made the only decision he could live with. The money was real, but it was downstream of something that couldn't be quantified, and Marcus knew the difference. He used enough of it to clear his debt and make Lily's future stable, a college fund in an account that would grow quietly over the next 10 years. A fund that he told Lily about on a Sunday evening, and that she received with a nod of such serious gravity that he had to look away to keep from laughing, because she was 8 years old and solemn about money in a way that was entirely her mother. With the rest, he opened a garage. It was small, 2 bays, a good lift, a parts room that smelled like metal and rubber and motor oil and felt, to him, like the most honest room he'd ever been inside. He put a small photograph of Claire on the wall above the tool bench, not framed, just fixed at the corners with pieces of tape. She was laughing in the photograph, caught mid-laugh, the way the best photographs catch people not posed, not ready, just real. He looked at it every morning when he unlocked the shop. He hired one mechanic to start, a young man named Travis who was better with transmissions than Marcus was, and who had a tendency to listen to loud music while he worked, which Marcus tolerated because the work was excellent and because the shop needed someone who arrived with energy instead of just competence. The garage did ordinary things: oil changes, brake work, exhaust systems, the unglamorous reliable maintenance that keeps the world moving without anyone noticing it. Marcus was good at it. He was more than good at it. He had an understanding of engines that went beyond training, something almost intuitive. The kind of knowledge that exists in the hands as much as the mind, that his father had passed to him in a language that had nothing to do with words. The sedan he kept. It sat in the first bay, with a printed sign above it that Lily had made in red marker on a piece of cardboard, carefully lettered, "This car is not for sale." The cracked headlight had been replaced. The dented quarter panel had been straightened. The gate impression on the front bumper had been left as it was, because Marcus felt it was honest, and because he liked to look at it. He had not repaired the interior panels that Daniel Ross had removed. They remained open, the neat bundled wiring visible. A record of what someone careful and desperate had done to build something purposeful out of available materials. The compartment under the rear seat was still there. Empty now, but there. Sophie and Lily became the kind of friends that form when two children recognize something true about each other before anyone has taught them the language for it. They were different in almost every surface way: Sophie's tutored composure, Lily's unguarded expressiveness, Sophie's curated quiet, Lily's cheerful noise, but underneath that they were both children who had learned early that the people who loved them could leave or disappear, and who carried that knowledge carefully, like something fragile they didn't fully know how to protect. They made a good pair. They had sleepovers on alternating weekends. They fought occasionally, and made up quickly, and understood each other in the specific way of children who have already been serious. Lily brought the rabbit to every sleepover. Sophie had bought her own stuffed animal, a bear that she kept on her nightstand, with the practiced nonchalance of someone who does not want to seem sentimental and is entirely sentimental. Evelyn stopped by the garage one afternoon in early spring, unannounced, wearing clothes that were still expensive but somehow less armored-looking than before. She stood in the doorway of the first bay with a coffee from the place down the block and watched Marcus work on a customer's truck for a few minutes without either of them saying anything. Then she said, "I owe you something that I'm not sure I have the right words for." Marcus looked up from the truck. He had grease on his forearm and the particular calm expression of a person in the middle of work they understand. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I needed a car." She looked at the sedan behind him, at the cardboard sign above it. She almost smiled, not quite, but close, which for Evelyn Carter was the equivalent of someone else laughing out loud. She set the coffee on the workbench and left without fanfare, which was how Marcus preferred things to go. Lily asked him, on a Saturday morning in June, while they were eating cereal at the kitchen table that had been refinished now but was still the same table, with the same worn soft surface and the same mismatched chairs. He'd bought 2 matching ones at an estate sale, but hadn't been able to bring himself to get rid of the originals, so now there were 6 chairs for a 2-person table, which Lily had decided was ideal for guests. "Dad, do you regret buying that car?" She asked it with the careful face of someone who has been thinking about the question for a while and is finally ready to ask it. And with the specific quality of attention she brought to things she considered important, which was her mother's quality, and also, somehow, already entirely her own. Marcus put down his spoon. He looked at his daughter, 8 years old, and full of her mother's eyes, and her own particular, irreplaceable self, sitting in the morning light in a blue sweater, holding her cereal spoon like a small scepter. He thought about $500 and a hole in a boot sole and a salvage yard that smelled like rust and rain. He thought about a man who had recorded a video in a home office with the quiet voice of someone who understood that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it, and who had put the evidence in the safest place available to him. He thought about a compartment in a floor. He thought about 9 words scratched into metal. He thought about an engine that ran clean when it had no business running at all. He thought about a highway in a storm and a gate that gave way. He thought about Lily's hands in his jacket on a loading dock, gripping like they intended to hold on. He thought about 2 girls on a sofa, one asleep, one keeping watch, and a stuffed rabbit tucked under a chin. He thought about Daniel Ross, who had trusted a broken car with the only thing that mattered, and had not been wrong. He thought about Claire, laughing in a photograph above a tool bench in a shop that smelled like honesty and motor oil. Marcus looked at his daughter, and he smiled, the real kind. The kind that starts somewhere deep and works its way out slowly. The kind you cannot manufacture because it comes from knowing something true. "Best decision I ever made," he said. Lily nodded, satisfied, as though the answer had confirmed something she already believed and had only needed to hear aloud. She went back to her cereal. Outside, the morning was ordinary and bright, and the garage 2 blocks away was opening for the day, and the sedan sat in its bay. Under the hand-lettered cardboard sign, "This car is not for sale, patient," and road-worn and dented, and still, in every way that mattered, running.